A millionaire in disguise falls in love with the maid while investigating his own hotel staff. The reflection in the service elevator mirror didn't lie. Julian Brooks adjusted his fake Mark Peterson name badge and ran his hand over his gray staff uniform, so different from the Italian suits he usually wore. His heart was racing, not because of the lie he was about to live, but because of the magnitude of what he had discovered the night before. A difference of almost $2 million in the accounts of the Sapphire Bay Resort, his crown jewel in San Diego. Top floor, housekeeping department, announced the metallic voice from the elevator. Julian took a deep breath, rehearsing for the last time his Midwestern accent that he had practiced for weeks. As CEO of Brooks Hospitality Group, he knew every number, every report for his 15 hotels, but something at Sapphire Bay didn't add up. The audits found nothing, but his instinct screamed that something was wrong. Across the corridor, Hazel Turner was organizing her cleaning trolley with the precision of someone who has been doing it for years, even though she had only been at the hotel for 3 weeks. Her delicate fingers, more used to handling surveillance equipment than cleaning products, moved with a rehearsed naturalness. The private investigator had built her reputation unraveling complex cases of corporate fraud, but this mission was different. The minority shareholders of Brooks Hospitality Group suspected that Julian Brooks himself was embezzling funds. "Good morning." Julian waved to Hazel, playing the part of the nervous rookie employee. Their gazes met for a moment, and something inexplicable passed between them. Hazel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the corridor. "Good morning," she replied, allowing herself a genuine smile. "You must be the new Mark." "I'm Hazel." The morning passed like a carefully choreographed dance. Julian learned the cleaning protocols while discreetly rummaging through files on the governance computer during breaks. Hazel, meanwhile, mapped out the routines of the senior staff, especially interested in the behavior patterns of Regina Lawrence, the finance manager who always seemed to be in the right place at the wrong time. During lunch in the staff cafeteria, Julian and Hazel met again. He carried a packed lunch prepared to maintain his disguise, while she balanced a pre-prepared salad from the hotel cafe. "Can I sit down?" Julian asked, genuinely attracted by her presence, momentarily forgetting his mission. "Of course," Hazel replied. Pushing aside some papers she was pretending to study for an online course in hotel management. The conversation flowed naturally, surprising them both. Julian discovered that Hazel had a sharp sense of humor and an insight that intrigued him. Hazel, for her part, found in Mark a depth she hadn't expected from a simple cleaning worker. "It's funny," Hazel commented, playing with her fork. "You don't look like someone who would spend their life cleaning hotel rooms." Julian swallowed. "Looks can be deceiving," he replied, aware of the irony in his words. "And you? Have you always wanted to be a chambermaid?" "Life takes us down interesting paths," she deflected, her green eyes studying him with a curiosity that went beyond the professional. In the afternoon, while Mark and Hazel were working together preparing a presidential suite, a suspicious movement caught their attention. Regina Lawrence hurried into a private meeting room with a man who wasn't wearing an ID badge. Julian recognized the visitor. Mason Crawford, a former competitor in the hotel business, known for questionable business tactics. What was he doing there, in an unscheduled meeting? Hazel noticed the change in Mark's posture and made a mental note. Her experience as an investigator meant that this encounter was significant. By the end of the day, Julian was exhausted, not only from the physical work he wasn't used to, but also from the weight of the day's discoveries. In his secret office set up in an apartment next to the hotel, he was going through his notes when his phone vibrated. It was a message from an insider. Important documents were to be transferred from Regina's office to an unknown location the following morning. At the same time, in her rented room a few blocks away, Hazel was receiving a coded email from the shareholders. "Evidence suggests the operation is bigger than we thought. Brooks may not be the right target." Lying in their respective beds that night, both Julian and Hazel reflected on the day. They both felt that they had found more than they had expected, not only in terms of the investigation, but also on a personal level. What had begun as a fact-finding mission was turning into something more complex, where truths and lies were mixed with unexpected feelings. Julian picked up his phone, hesitated, and then typed a message to the number Hazel had shared earlier. thanks for today. I hope we can work together again tomorrow." Hazel smiled as she read the message, feeling a twinge of guilt. Her daily report to the shareholders was incomplete for the first time in her career. Something was stopping her from sharing certain details about Mark Peterson, details that her intuition told her were important, but that her heart wanted to keep to herself. The first day was over, but the cards of a much bigger story were just beginning to move. At Sapphire Bay Resort, where luxury and secrets coexisted in apparent harmony, two people who had grown close through lies were about to discover that the deepest truth sometimes hides behind the masks we wear to protect ourselves. The morning began with a disturbing discovery. Julian, still disguised as Mark Peterson, found a brown envelope hidden among the clean towels in the service trolley. His heart raced as he recognized Regina Lawrence's elegant handwriting on the addressee. MC, Mason Crawford, no doubt. "What's up, Mark?" Hazel appeared silently behind him, making him startle and quickly hide the envelope in his uniform pocket. "Yeah, just organizing the towels," he replied, trying to keep his composure as his pulse raced. The soft scent of lavender emanating from her momentarily distracted him from his worries. The investigator noticed the change in his posture, but pretended not to notice. Years of experience had taught her that people always reveal more when they think they're not being watched. Still, there was something about Mark that intrigued her more and more, a complexity that didn't match his supposed function. The day at Sapphire Bay Resort continued with its apparently normal routine, but under the surface, tensions were growing. While cleaning the 12th floor, Julian and Hazel witnessed a heated argument between Regina Lawrence and a man they identified as Frank Martinez, the hotel's financial controller. "The numbers have to be in by Friday," hissed Regina, unaware of the presence of the two employees in the hallway. "Crawford won't wait any longer." Frank looked nervous, running his hands through his gray hair. "It's not that simple. The transfers are attracting attention." Julian pretended to be busy cleaning a mirror, but every word of the conversation was like a piece fitting into a larger puzzle. Hazel, for her part, discreetly activated the recorder on her wristwatch, one of the many gadgets she carried with her. Over lunch, Julian decided to take a chance. "Have you noticed anything strange about Regina Lawrence?" he asked Hazel, studying her reaction. She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Apart from the fact that she always seems to be whispering in corners?" "Not much," she replied with an enigmatic smile. The afternoon brought a series of events that heightened the tension. A laptop was left open in the meeting room, and Julian took a moment alone to have a quick look. What he saw made his blood run cold. Detailed spreadsheets of bank transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, all with amounts that matched the discrepancies he had noticed in the financial reports. Meanwhile, Hazel was conducting her own investigation. While cleaning one of the executive rooms, she found a USB stick hidden behind the minibar. Her training told her to take it, but something made her hesitate. If she had learned anything in her career, it was that planted evidence could be as dangerous as it was useful. The day progressed, and the chemistry between the two continued to grow, mixed with the tension of their parallel investigations. During a break, they shared a coffee in the staff rest area. "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that isn't yours?" Julian asked, surprising himself with the honesty of the question. Hazel almost choked on her coffee. "More often than I'd like to admit," she replied, thinking of all the identities she had already assumed in her investigations. "Sometimes it's hard to remember who we really are." The moment of vulnerability was interrupted by an alert on Julian's phone, a message from his insider. Suspicious movement in the accounting office. Documents being destroyed. "I need to check something," he said, standing up abruptly. "I'll go with you," Hazel replied, following her investigative instinct. On their way to the accounting office, they came across Mason Crawford hurrying out of the hotel. He was carrying a black briefcase and looked agitated. Julian and Hazel exchanged meaningful glances. When they arrived at the finance department, they found Regina Lawrence alone, standing in front of a printer looking upset. Fragments of shredded paper overflowed from the garbage can next to it. "Sorry, restricted area," Regina said dryly when she saw them. "We've come to check the air conditioning," Hazel improvised quickly. "There have been complaints about the noise." As they pretended to inspect the air vents, Julian noticed a partially destroyed document with the Brooks Hospitality Group logo. His heart raced as he recognized part of his own signature on one of the fragments. Back in the corridor, Hazel lightly touched Julian's arm. "There's something very wrong here," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, fighting the urge to reveal his true identity right then and there. "And I think it's getting dangerous." At the end of the day, they both left the hotel with more questions than answers. Julian, in his temporary apartment, examined the envelope he had found earlier. Inside, he found documents that suggested an elaborate money laundering operation, but something didn't add up. The signatures in his name seemed too perfect. Hazel, in her rented room, analyzed the day's recordings while typing up her report to the shareholders. Her hand hovered over the keyboard as she reached the part about Mark Peterson. For the first time in her career, she caught herself omitting details from her investigation. Her phone vibrated with a message from him. "Do you want to have coffee tomorrow before you shift?" She smiled, answering in the affirmative before her reason could protest. Then she received another email from the shareholders. Evidence suggests involvement of senior executives. Closely monitor Regina Lawrence and her associates. That night, both Julian and Hazel slept restlessly, their minds filled with conspiracy theories and their hearts heavy with the weight of their secrets. Tomorrow would be another day of masks and investigations, but now there was something else at stake, something neither of them had planned for. True feelings growing amidst a web of lies. Breakfast in the small bistro next to the Sapphire Bay Resort began with a silence fraught with unspoken tension. Julian watched Hazel over his coffee cup, admiring how the morning light highlighted the golden tones in her brown hair. She discreetly checked her phone, frowning slightly as she read a message. "Is something wrong?" Julian asked, trying to maintain the Midwestern accent that occasionally threatened to slip out. "Nothing important," Hazel replied, putting her cell phone away. In fact, it was an urgent message from the shareholders. Possible information leak. An insider is suspected. The conversation was interrupted when they both noticed Mason Crawford entering the bistro. He wasn't alone. At his side was a woman Julian recognized immediately. Claire Morrison, his former CFO who had abruptly resigned 6 months ago. "I think we'd better go," Hazel whispered, noticing the change in her companion's posture. But it was too late for a discreet exit. Claire walked past her desk, pausing for a moment as she recognized Julian. Her eyes widened slightly, but she kept her composure, continuing on her way as if she had seen nothing. Julian felt his heart race. Claire knew his true identity. At the hotel, the day began with a different atmosphere. Regina Lawrence was visibly agitated, pacing the corridors with a phone stuck to her ear. "We can't wait any longer," she hissed. "Brooks is getting suspicious." Hazel, pretending to clean the nearby handrails, registered every word. The mention of Brooks' name made her look instinctively at Mark, who was also nearby, supposedly checking the emergency exits. During the afternoon, while they were cleaning an executive suite together, Julian found another compromising document lying behind an armchair, a memo detailing bank transfers with Claire Morrison's signature. "Hazel," he called out, his voice deeper than usual, "I think you need to see this." She moved closer, her shoulder brushing lightly against his as she examined the document. The touch, though brief, sent an electric current through both their bodies. "This is bigger than we imagined," Hazel murmured, momentarily forgetting her role as a simple chambermaid. "How do you know?" Julian asked, arching an eyebrow. Before she could come up with an excuse, shouts from the corridor interrupted the conversation. Frank Martinez was arguing violently with Regina. "I can't be a part of this anymore," he shouted. "They're going to get us." Julian and Hazel exchanged worried glances. Minutes later, they saw Frank hurrying out of the hotel, carrying a briefcase full of documents. During the lunch break, Julian received an encrypted message from his internal contact. Frank Martinez found unconscious in the parking lot. Documents missing. At the same time, Hazel received an urgent email. "Morrison is the key. Get close to her." The rest of the afternoon passed in a whirlwind of events. A team of paramedics discreetly removed Frank, while Regina Lawrence locked herself in her living room with Mason Crawford. Claire Morrison was seen entering the hotel through the service entrance, avoiding the security cameras. "We need to talk," Julian said to Hazel when they were finally alone in the cleaning supplies room. Not here, not now, but tonight. Hazel hesitated, her professional training fighting against the growing trust she felt for him. The pier in La Jolla at 9? Julian nodded, aware that he was about to make a decision that would change everything. He planned to reveal his true identity, not because he had to, but because he needed to be honest with her. What he didn't know was that Hazel had come to the same decision. The investigation was taking too dangerous a turn to maintain his cover, especially with someone who had become so important to her. At the end of the day, they both prepared for their evening meeting. Julian, in his apartment, stored crucial documents that proved an elaborate fraud involving Claire Morrison and Mason Crawford. Hazel, in her bedroom, was organizing evidence that pointed to a much larger conspiracy than a simple embezzlement investigation. The sun was setting over San Diego when Hazel received one last disturbing message. Morrison plans to leave the country tonight. Intercept her at any cost. Julian, for his part, discovered that his cover had been compromised. Claire had sent an email to Regina Lawrence. Brooks is at the hotel, undercover. As they drove separately to the La Jolla pier, neither of them knew that they were about to face not only the truth about their identities, but also a night that would permanently change the course of their lives. The sky was darkening over the Pacific Ocean, and the city lights were beginning to glow like silent witnesses to secrets about to be revealed. The sound of the waves breaking against the pillars of the La Jolla pier barely masked the tension in the air. Julian arrived first, still wearing the simple clothes of his disguise, but carrying a briefcase with all the evidence he had collected. The sea breeze ruffled his hair as he watched the city lights reflected in the dark water. Hazel appeared minutes later, her hesitant footsteps echoing on the wooden planks of the pier. She had swapped her hotel uniform for jeans and a light jacket, a small tape recorder hidden in her pocket, a precaution that now seemed an unnecessary burden. "Mark," she began, stopping a few paces away from him. "Or maybe I should say, Mr. Brooks?" Julian turned, surprised. "How?" "In the same way that you've probably figured out by now that I'm not really a chambermaid," Hazel replied, a sad smile playing on her lips. Before they could continue their conversation, the sound of hurried footsteps caught their attention. Claire Morrison emerged from the shadows, accompanied by two men in suits whom Julian recognized as Mason Crawford's security guards. "What an interesting meeting," Claire commented, her voice cutting like the cold night wind. "The undercover CEO and the shareholder's private investigator? Mason will love to hear about it." Julian and Hazel instinctively moved closer to each other, their backs to the ocean. The situation had turned into a trap, and the only ways out were through Claire or a dive several meters into the dark waters below. "It was you who orchestrated all this, wasn't it, Claire?" Julian asked, his voice laden with disappointment. "The embezzlement, the forged signatures, the attack on Frake." "You've always been brilliant at business, Julian," Claire replied, stepping forward. "But you've also always been naive. Did you really think you could investigate discreetly without anyone noticing?" Hazel slid her hand inside her jacket, touching the small recording device. Claire's every word was being recorded, but that wouldn't help if they couldn't get out of there. "The shareholders were right about a conspiracy," Hazel interjected, trying to buy time, "but they missed the mark. It was never about Julian. It was about you and Crawford trying to take over Brooks' hospitality group." Claire laughed, a cold sound that mingled with the sound of the waves. "Brilliant deduction. Too bad it came too late. Right now, documents are being sent to the SEC showing fabricated evidence that Julian Brooks embezzled millions. When the dust settles, Mason Crawford will be seen as the savior who exposed the fraud." Julian felt his blood boil. Years of building his reputation, expanding the hotel chain his father had started, all threatened by an elaborate betrayal. "Why, Claire?" he asked, his voice laden with restrained emotion. "Because you never saw me as more than an employee," she spat out the words. "Crawford offered me a real partnership, real power." One of the security guards stepped forward, his hand inside his jacket making the implied threat clear. Hazel realized that they had seconds to act. "Julian," she whispered, leaning slightly towards him, "trust me?" He met her eyes in the dim light and nodded imperceptibly. The next moment, Hazel threw her phone in the direction of the security guards. The camera flash went off automatically, temporarily blinding them. "Now!" she shouted, pulling Julian by the hand as she ran towards the end of the pier. Shots echoed in the night, bouncing off the wooden planks around them. Without hesitation, they both jumped into the dark waters of the Pacific. The shock of the cold water was like 1,000 needles in their bodies. Julian emerged first, searching desperately for Hazel in the darkness. She emerged a few meters ahead, gesturing for him to follow her towards the rocks below the pier. Hidden among the rock formations, they heard the excited voices above, orders being shouted, flashlights searching the water. Julian held Hazel close, feeling her shiver. "My car is parked 2 blocks south," she whispered through chattering teeth. "If we can get there, I have a safe place," Julian added. "An apartment that nobody knows about, not even my personal assistant." They waited a few more minutes, until the sounds of searching subsided. Carefully, they swam to a small beach nearby, emerging soaked but alive. In Hazel's car, as they drove through the streets of San Diego, the silence was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Julian broke the ice. "So, private investigator?" Hazel smiled. "Despite the situation, and you, a CEO disguised as a valet?" "I think we have a lot to talk about," he replied, realizing that, despite the lies and disguises, the feelings they had developed for each other were the only true thing in this whole story. In Julian's secure apartment, as they dried off and planned their next steps, the reality of the situation began to weigh on them. They had evidence against Claire and Crawford, but they needed to act fast before the fabricated story reached the SEC. "We need help," Hazel said, typing rapidly on her spare laptop. "I have contacts in the press who can expose the truth before the lie spreads." Julian nodded, his mind already working on a plan. "And I have access to records that can prove the signatures were forged, but we need to outsmart them this time." As the night wore on, Julian and Hazel worked side by side, their secret identities finally revealed, but a new secret being born between them, something deeper and truer than any disguise they had ever worn. The dawn would bring new challenges, but now they were no longer alone in their missions. The truth was about to come out, and with it, the promise of a redemption that neither of them had expected to find. The sun had not yet risen when Julian received the call that would change the course of his investigation. Frank Martinez had woken up in hospital and was ready to talk. Next to him in the secure apartment, Hazel was already putting on her jacket, her investigative instincts on high alert. "We need to get there before Claire and Crawford find out," said Hazel, checking her inconspicuous gun in its ankle holster, a precaution that now seemed more necessary than ever. Mercy Hospital was relatively quiet when they arrived. A nurse led them to Frank's room, where 2 policemen stood guard. Julian noticed the bruises on the ex-controller's face, clear evidence of the violence he had suffered. "Mr. Brooks," Frank said in a hoarse voice, "I knew you'd come, and you must be the shareholder investigator." He nodded to Hazel. "Claire mentioned that there was someone undercover." "Frank, we need to know everything." Julian approached the bed. "The documents you are carrying, they're safe," Frank interrupted, reaching with difficulty for a small USB stick hidden in his wristwatch. "I made backups of everything." Claire and Crawford had been planning this for months. The idea was to create a trail of false documents that would incriminate you, while diverting funds to shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Hazel plugged the drive into her laptop, her eyes quickly scanning the files. "This is bigger than we imagined. They weren't just targeting Sapphire Bay, there are documents on every hotel in the chain." A noise in the hallway made everyone freeze. Through the glass door, they saw Regina Lawrence talking to one of the doctors. Julian and Hazel exchanged tense glances. "The emergency exit," Hazel whispered, already putting her laptop away. "Frank, are you safe here?" The controller nodded. "The police are reliable. Deputy Thompson is personally involved in the case." As they descended the emergency staircase, Julian received urgent messages on his phone. The news was already starting to leak out. CEO of Brooks Hospitality Group suspected of $1 million fraud. "We need a safe place to analyze this data," Hazel said as they ran across the parking lot. "I know someone who can help." 30 minutes later, they were in the discreet office of Marcus Chen, a financial crimes expert Hazel knew from previous cases. The office, located in an old building in downtown San Diego, was a maze of servers and monitors. "This is professional work," Marcus commented, looking at the documents. "Whoever forged these signatures knows blockchain technology well, but they made a mistake." Julian leaned over the monitor. "What mistake?" "The timestamps of the documents. Some have been backdated, but the metadata shows the actual creation dates, all in the last 3 months, coinciding with Claire's secret meetings with Crawford." Hazel was about to reply when her phone vibrated a message from her contacts at the shareholders. "Crawford has called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. Vote to remove Brooks." "We don't have much time." Julian ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "They'll try to bring me down before we can expose the truth." "Maybe that's exactly what we need," Hazel said, her eyes sparkling with an idea. "What if we let them think they've won?" The plan began to take shape as the sun rose over the San Diego skyline. Marcus worked furiously on his computers, tracing the path of the money through a complex network of offshore companies. Julian and Hazel were coordinating with Deputy Thompson, preparing a trap that depended on perfect timing. "Are you sure about this?" Julian asked Hazel as they prepared to put the plan into action. "If something goes wrong," she held his hand, the touch sending that familiar electric current between them. "Trust me, this time, we'll turn the tables." As the morning progressed, the pieces began to move. Julian sent his confirmation to the board meeting, seemingly surrendered to the inevitable. Hazel activated her network of contacts in the press, planting strategic stories that seemed to confirm the accusations against Brooks. In Marcus' office, monitors showed real-time bank transactions being tracked. A pattern began to emerge: large transfers being prepared to international accounts. "They're taking the bait," Marcus announced, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Crawford just authorized emergency transfers. They're trying to clear everything up before the story blows up." Julian checked his watch. In 2 hours, he would face the board that would try to oust him. But before that, he had one last card to play, one that Claire and Crawford would never see coming. "It's time," he said, adjusting his tie as he prepared to leave. He paused for a moment, looking at Hazel. "Whatever happens," she interrupted him with a quick but intense kiss. "Go on. Show them who Julian Brooks really is." As he left to face his fate in the boardroom, Hazel and Marcus continued their part of the plan, knowing that the next few hours would determine not only the future of Brooks' Hospitality Group, but also the fate of everyone involved in this web of lies and betrayals. The boardroom on the top floor of Brooks' Hospitality Group was buzzing with tension when Julian entered. 10 pairs of eyes watched him with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Claire Morrison and Mason Crawford occupied strategic places at the table, their confident smiles denouncing the certainty of victory. "Gentlemen, ladies," Julian greeted, maintaining the composure his father had always taught him to show in moments of crisis. "Before we begin, I'd like to share some relevant information." "Julian," Crawford interrupted, his mellifluous voice hiding venom. "I think the documents circulated this morning already speak for themselves." A murmur went through the room. Julian noticed some members of the council exchanging worried glances. Meanwhile, in Marcus Chen's office, Hazel and the financial crimes specialist were monitoring every movement of the offshore accounts identified. "Transfer initiated," Marcus announced, his fingers dancing over the keyboard. "Crawford is trying to move $50 million to Cayman." Hazel immediately activated her team. "Now, Thompson." Back in the boardroom, Julian allowed Crawford to continue his exposé, detailing supposed evidence of fraud and mismanagement. Claire occasionally supplemented with seemingly irrefutable data. "And so," Crawford concluded with a solemn air, "we propose the immediate removal of Julian Brooks as CEO, replaced temporarily by me, to ensure the stability of the company." Julian stood up calmly, connecting his laptop to the projector in the room. "Your concern for stability is interesting, Mr. Crawford, especially considering this." The screen showed a series of bank transfers in real time. At the same moment, the doors to the room opened and Deputy Thompson entered, accompanied by 2 federal agents. "What does that mean?" Claire stood up abruptly, her confidence wavering for the first time. "It means," Julian replied, his voice firm, "that you've fallen into your own trap. Every transfer you've made in the last 20 minutes has been traced and documented. including the ones you've just tried to make. Crawford reached for his phone, but one of the agents stopped him. Mason Crawford, Claire Morrison, you're under arrest for corporate fraud, falsifying documents, and attempted extortion. In Marcus' office, Hazel watched the scene through the security cameras, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. Her phone vibrated with messages from the shareholders. The evidence was irrefutable. System blocked, Marcus announced. All transfers have been reversed and accounts frozen. Back in the boardroom, Julian presented the real evidence. Frank Martinez's documents, the recordings of the hotel conversations, the forgery records discovered by Marcus. As you can see, he explained to the stunned counsel, there was indeed a conspiracy, but not on my part. Crawford and Morrison planned not only to bring me down, but to take complete control of the company through a series of fraudulent financial maneuvers. Claire, handcuffed, maintained her haughty posture. You don't understand, Julian. It's always been about power. You never really knew how to use it. No, Claire, he replied. You're the one who never understood. Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. As the agents led Crawford and Claire out, Julian received a message from Hazel. Mission accomplished. Meet me back at our place. The board voted unanimously to retain Julian as CEO and to open a full audit to identify possible accomplices in the scam. Hours later, on the pier in La Jolla, where everything had almost ended the night before, Julian found Hazel watching the sunset. The Pacific Ocean reflected shades of orange and pink, as if celebrating the outcome. The shareholders are pleased, she said as he approached. My mission is officially over. And now? Julian asked, stopping beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Now, I don't know. Usually when a case is over, I'm already looking for the next one. Julian turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. What if I had a different proposal? Sapphire Bay Resort needs a new security director. Someone with your experience would be perfect for the job. Hazel smiled, remembering the days when she pretended to be just a chambermaid. Would that be unethical, considering our personal involvement? Probably, he replied, a smile playing on his lips. But I think we've proved that some rules are made to be broken. The sun dipped below the horizon as they sealed that moment with a kiss, unlike any other. No disguises, no secrets, just the truth of two hearts meeting in the midst of a conspiracy. The next day, the newspapers would print headlines about the attempted coup at Brooks Hospitality Group, but the real story, that of two investigators who found something more valuable than evidence, would remain a sweet secret between them. A week after Claire and Crawford's arrest, the Sapphire Bay Resort was buzzing with a different energy. Julian, now operating openly as CEO, walked through the corridors he had previously walked undercover, observing his hotel with new eyes. The constant presence of federal agents digging through records and interrogating employees created a tense but necessary atmosphere. Hazel, newly appointed director of security, coordinated a team dedicated to tracking down every penny embezzled. Her office, once Regina Lawrence's office, had been transformed into an operations center full of monitors and documents. We found something interesting, said Hazel when Julian entered her office that morning. The transfers didn't start with Claire. There's a pattern going back 3 years. Julian leaned over the computer screen, frowning as he analyzed the data. That was before Claire became CFO. Exactly, Hazel replied, pulling up another file. And look who was on the board back then. The name that jumped out of the screen made Julian freeze. Richard Hawthorne, his godfather and mentor after his father's death. The man who had guided him through his first years as CEO. That can't be right, he muttered, but the evidence was crystal clear. At that moment, Marcus Chan rushed into the room. You need to see this? Crawford started talking. The video of the interrogation showed a different Mason Crawford from the confident businessman they knew. Shaken, he detailed a conspiracy that went far beyond Sapphire Bay. Hawthorne planned the whole thing, Crawford confessed in the video. He wanted Brooks Hospitality Group ever since Julian's father died. Claire was just the final executor of the plan. Hazel watched Julian absorb the impact of that revelation. Her hand found his under the table, offering silent support. We need to act fast, she said. If Hawthorne suspects we've found out, he must already know, Julian interrupted, standing up abruptly. Richard has always had informants everywhere. Even an alarm sounded on his phone, attempted unauthorized access to the company's main servers. Marcus jumped to his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Someone is trying to delete records remotely," he reported, his voice tense. "I'm trying to block it, but where's the access coming from?" Hazel was already on the move, coordinating her security team by radio. "IP address, Mission Hills," Marcus replied. "Mansion registered in the name of a shell company, but the location coincides with Richard's house," Julian added, reaching for his keys. Hazel followed him to the elevator. "You're not going alone," she declared, not a question but a statement. On the way to Mission Hills, Julian shared stories about Richard Hawthorne, the man who had been like a second father, who had taught him the ins and outs of business, who had been present at every important moment of his adult life. "He came to my office the day I took over as CEO," Julian recalled, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "He said my father would be proud. All this time," Hazel touched his arm gently, "sometimes the closest people are the ones who can hurt us the deepest." The Hawthorne mansion, an impressive Mediterranean structure overlooking the ocean, was strangely silent when they arrived. The front door was ajar. "I don't like this," Hazel muttered, her hand instinctively going for her gun. "Wait here while I—" "No," Julian interrupted her. "I need to do this." They entered together, moving silently through the marble foyer. The sound of papers being handled came from the office at the end of the corridor. Richard Hawthorne stood with his back to the door, feeding a document shredder with frantic urgency. When he turned and saw Julian, his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, guilt, and finally, a mask of resigned calm. "It took longer than I expected for you to find out," he said, his voice tired. "Your father was slow to see the obvious too." "Why?" The word came out as a pained whisper from Julian's lips. "Because he trusted the wrong people too much," Hawthorne replied, taking a step towards his desk. "Just like you." Hawthorne's sudden movement towards a drawer was interrupted by Hazel's firm voice. "I wouldn't do that." Sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly approaching. Hawthorne smiled bitterly. "Do you know what your father's mistake was, Julian? He believed he could build an empire by being honest. But empires are built on lies and betrayals." "You're wrong," Julian replied, his voice finding strength. "The empire my father built is still standing. Yours? It's falling apart right now." When the federal agents raided the mansion minutes later, they found not only crucial evidence that Hawthorne had failed to destroy, but also a broken man who was finally realizing the weight of his choices. Back at Sapphire Bay that evening, Julian and Hazel watched the ocean from the rooftop of the hotel. The sun was setting over San Diego, painting the sky with shades of red and gold that seemed to reflect the tumultuous events of the day. "How do you move on after discovering that someone you loved like family has spent years plotting your downfall?" Julian asked, his voice laden with restrained emotion. Hazel intertwined her fingers with his. "One day at a time, and not alone." Julian's phone vibrated with a message from Marcus. The servers were secure, all the records preserved. The evidence was more than enough to guarantee that Hawthorne, Claire, and Crawford would face justice. "You know," Hazel said after a moment's silence, "when the shareholders hired me to investigate you, I never imagined I'd end up uncovering a movie-worthy conspiracy." Julian smiled for the first time that day. "And I never imagined I'd find someone like you pretending to be a chambermaid." The future still held challenges, but there, in that moment, they both knew they had found something more valuable than any corporate empire. A truth that didn't need to hide behind masks or disguises. The Sapphire Bay Resort shone in the San Diego morning sun as Julian walked through the now familiar corridors, no longer as an undercover employee, but as the CEO who was finally taking back the reins of his empire. The revelations about Richard Hawthorne still weighed heavily on his chest, but there was work to be done. The auditors have found 3 more offshore accounts linked to ghost subsidiaries, Hazel informed him, catching up with him in the lobby. Her new position as security director suited her well, as did the business suit that had replaced her maid's uniform. "How much?" Julian asked, heading for the elevator. "Approximately 12 million. Marcus is tracing the money, but there are indications that some of it was transferred to an account in Switzerland 2 days before Hawthorne's arrest. In the president's office, an FBI team was conducting interviews with key officials. Special Agent Catherine Reeves, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes, was waiting for them. "Mr. Brooks, we need to discuss Regina Lawrence," she said without preamble. "She's willing to cooperate in exchange for a deal." Julian and Hazel exchanged meaningful glances. Regina had been a key player in Hawthorne's scheme, serving as an intermediary between him and Crawford for years. "What's she offering?" Hazel asked, her investigative instincts sharp. "Names. Apparently, the conspiracy extends to other hotel chains. Hawthorne wasn't just targeting Brooks' hospitality group, it was part of a larger scheme to manipulate the hotel market on the West Coast." Julian sat heavily in his chair, processing the information. So it wasn't just personal, it was bigger than that. "It always has been," a familiar voice sounded from the doorway. Frank Martinez entered, still with visible marks from the assault, but with determination in his gaze. Hawthorne was building his own empire in the shadows, using inside information from various networks to manipulate market values. Hazel was already at her tablet, connecting dots. The acquisition patterns of the last 3 years. All those family networks suddenly selling out to shady investment groups. All connected to Hawthorne through shell companies, Frank added. "I found out by accident when I was auditing Sapphire Bay's accounts." Julian's phone vibrated. It was Marcus. "You need to see this. I've just decrypted Hawthorne's emails. There's something much bigger going on." In the makeshift operations center they had set up in Regina's old office, Marcus projected a series of documents onto the main screen. Hawthorne was planning a hostile merger, not just of Brooks' hospitality group, but of 5 other major West Coast chains, creating a virtual monopoly of the luxury hotel sector, Hazel muttered, her analytical mind already processing the implications. Julian felt the weight of betrayal deepen. Richard Hawthorne hadn't just betrayed his personal trust, he had plotted to destroy the legacy of generations of independent hoteliers. "Agent Reeves," he turned to the FBI agent, "how much do you need to build a federal case? With what we have now, we can take down Hawthorne, but if we want to expose the whole network, we need more." Hazel was already one step ahead. "The servers in Hawthorne's mansion. He didn't have time to destroy everything. If we can get access, we already have a warrant," Reeves confirmed. "Technical teams are on their way." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. While the FBI team combed through Hawthorne's digital records, Julian and Hazel coordinated with Marcus to protect Brooks' hospitality group's assets. "We need to get ahead of this," Hazel argued during a coffee break. "If this leaks to the press in the wrong way." "I've already thought of that," Julian replied, picking up his phone. "Remember Rachel Morgan from the San Diego Tribune? She owes me a few favors." The investigative reporter arrived at Sapphire Bay an hour later, her eyes sparkling at the prospect of an explosive story. Julian and Hazel carefully presented the evidence, constructing the narrative that would expose the conspiracy without devastating the hotel market. "This is going to win a Pulitzer," Rachel muttered, absorbing the documents. "When do you want to publish it?" "Tomorrow," Julian decided, after the FBI completes the first phase of the arrests. That evening, after an exhausting day, Julian and Hazel found a quiet moment on the rooftop of the hotel. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of amber and pink. "You know what's ironic?" Julian commented, his gaze lost on the horizon. "Hawthorne always said I was a lot like my father, too trusting of people." Hazel moved closer, her presence a silent comfort. "And perhaps that's exactly your greatest strength. You trust, but you're not naive. You've built a loyal team not through fear or manipulation, but mutual respect." Julian turned to her, a soft smile on his lips. "Including a private investigator disguised as a chambermaid?" "Especially her," Hazel replied, returning the smile. "After all, she ended up trusting you too." Julian's phone vibrated once again. It was Marcus. The FBI team had found something on Hawthorne servers that would change everything. Tomorrow would be a new day, with new challenges and revelations. But there, at that moment, under the darkening sky over San Diego, Julian Brooks knew that he wouldn't face any of this alone. "Ready for another round?" he asked Hazel. Always, she replied, already checking her messages. After all, we still have an empire to protect. Night was falling over the Sapphire Bay Resort, but the lights in the offices were still on. The truth, as always, needed vigilant guardians, and they were more than prepared for this mission. The San Diego Tribune story exploded like a bomb in the corporate world. $1 million conspiracy, the plan to monopolize the West Coast hotel industry, was on the front page, along with photos of Richard Hawthorne being escorted by federal agents from his mansion in Mission Hills. Julian watched the report on his tablet while Hazel coordinated a video conference with the directors of the other hotel chains affected by the conspiracy. The operations center at Sapphire Bay had been transformed into a cooperative investigation hub. Hawthorne's servers revealed connections with at least 3 senators, Marcus reported, projecting documents onto the main screen. He was buying political influence to facilitate hostile takeovers. And that's not all, Hazel added, sliding a file across the conference table. We found evidence that Claire Morrison was blackmailing executives from other chains using information gathered during their stays in our hotels. Julian felt his stomach turn. The idea that his own chain had been used to collect compromising information was nauseating. How many guests were affected? We're still working out the numbers, Marcus replied, but it looks like they had a sophisticated surveillance system installed in the executive suites of the major hotels. A knock on the door interrupted the discussion. It was Catherine Reeves from the FBI, accompanied by a man Julian recognized immediately. Robert Turner, CEO of Pacific Coast Hotels, one of the chains that would be the target of the hostile takeover. Mr. Brooks, Turner began, his voice charged with emotion, I've come personally to thank you. If you hadn't exposed this conspiracy, please call me Julian, he replied, indicating a chair. And the credit is not mine alone. Without Hazel and our team, we would never have discovered the true extent of Hawthorne's plan. The meeting that followed was intense. Turner revealed that he had been pressured by Hawthorne to sell his network for a fraction of its real value, using personal information obtained during his stays at Sapphire Bay. They had everything, Turner confessed, running a hand over his tired face. Private conversations, confidential meetings, even intimate moments with my family. I was about to give in. Hazel made detailed notes, her investigative instinct on high alert. We need to identify all the compromised rooms and remove the surveillance devices. Marcus, can you coordinate a full sweep? We're already on it, the tech expert replied. We've found cameras and microphones in 15 suites so far, all connected to a remote server. Julian felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just about saving his own company now, it was about protecting the privacy and dignity of hundreds of guests who trusted his hotels. We're going to need a solid communication plan, he said, turning to Hazel. Something that will reassure our guests without causing panic. I already have some ideas, she replied, her eyes shining with determination. We can turn this into an opportunity to set new safety standards in the industry. The afternoon progressed with a series of strategic meetings. Representatives from other hotel chains arrived, each bringing their own stories of pressure and manipulation. What had started as an internal investigation had turned into an industry-wide reform movement. We need to create an independent ethics board, Julian proposed during a break. Something that oversees security and privacy practices across all networks. And I know the perfect person to lead that, Hazel smiled, pointing to Catherine Reeves, who had demonstrated a deep understanding of both the legal and ethical aspects of the case. As the sun set over San Diego, Julian and Hazel found a quiet moment in the hotel garden. The air was scented with jasmine, and the lights of the city began to twinkle in the distance. You changed everything, Julian said softly, observing Hazel's profile against the pink sky. When the shareholders hired you to investigate me, they never imagined that you would end up saving not only the company, but the entire industry. Hazel smiled, entwining her fingers with his. In fact, you changed everything. Your courage in standing up to Hawthorne, your willingness to expose the truth even if it hurt, it inspired others to do the same. An employee approached discreetly, handing Julian an envelope. It was a letter from Richard Hawthorne, sent from prison. Julian hesitated, feeling the weight of the paper in his hands. Do you want me to read it first? Hazel offered, noticing his hesitation. No, he replied, tucking the envelope into his pocket. "Some truths can wait. Now we have an empire to rebuild the right way this time." Hazel's phone vibrated with a message from Marcus. The sweep was over, and the last surveillance devices had been removed. It was the end of an era of shadows and the beginning of something new. "You know," she said, turning to Julian with an enigmatic smile, "for someone who started out investigating me disguised as a chambermaid, I think I did pretty well as security director." Julian laughed, pulling her closer. "And for someone who was supposed to be investigating me, you did a surprisingly good job of helping me save everything." Night fell over the Sapphire Bay Resort, but the lights of the hotel shone brighter than ever, a beacon of integrity in an industry that was beginning to rediscover itself. Julian and Hazel stood in the garden for a moment longer, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but confident that they would face everything together. A year had passed since the Hawthorne conspiracy was exposed, and the Sapphire Bay Resort shone in a new light. Julian watched the movement of the lobby through the newly installed security cameras, no longer instruments of blackmail, but true guardians of guest privacy. "The figures for the first quarter are in," Hazel announced, entering her office with a folder. "The implementation of the new security system has increased our occupancy rate by 35%. Looks like transparency really sells." Julian smiled, remembering how it had all started. He, disguised as an employee, and she, an investigator pretending to be a chambermaid. Now they were the most respected duo in the West Coast hotel industry. "The ethics board meets in an hour," he reminded her, adjusting his tie. "Catherine has some updates on the Hawthorne case." In the main conference room, executives from several hotel chains were meeting for the monthly session of the newly formed Hotel Industry Ethics Council. Catherine Reeves, now executive director of the council, ran the meeting with her usual efficiency. "The latest investigations have revealed international ramifications," she reported, projecting documents onto the screen. "Hawthorne had connections with hotel groups in Europe and Asia. Interpol is now involved." Robert Turner, from Pacific Coast Hotels, raised his hand. "What about the surveillance devices? Can we trace all the buyers?" Marcus, who had been hired as a cybersecurity consultant for the entire board, moved forward a few slides. "We identified 87% of the buyers of the information. Most were investment funds trying to gain an advantage in negotiations. All are being prosecuted." Julian looked around the room, noticing how the former competitors were now working together. Hawthorne's betrayal, ironically, had united the industry in a way that no one had imagined possible. "I got a letter from Claire yesterday," Hazel commented quietly, just for Julian to hear. "She wants to make a plea bargain. Apparently, there are more big names involved." The news didn't surprise Julian. In recent weeks, several people connected to Hawthorne had begun to speak out, revealing a web of corruption that stretched back decades. After the meeting, Julian and Hazel walked to the La Jolla Pier, their special place since that fateful night a year ago. The afternoon sun painted the ocean golden, and seagulls circled lazily over the waves. "Have you read Hawthorne's letter?" Hazel asked, knowing that the envelope still remained unopened in Julian's drawer. "This morning," he replied, his gaze lost on the horizon. "He tried to justify everything. He said my father was weak for not seeing that the business world required extreme measures, still trying to manipulate, even from prison." Hazel intertwined her fingers in his. "And how do you feel about that?" "At peace, actually," Julian smiled slightly. "Because he was wrong. My father built something lasting based on trust and integrity, and we've proved that this legacy can not only survive, but thrive." His phone vibrated. It was Frank Martinez, now recovered and working as a compliance consultant. "You need to see this." The audit of the old Hawthorne properties revealed something interesting. Back at the hotel, Frank presented his discovery, documents showing that Hawthorne had started his surveillance operation much earlier than they thought, even when Julian's father was alive. "He'd been collecting information on his father for years," Frank explained, waiting for the right moment to act. The revelation hit Julian like a punch, but in a different way than it would have a year ago. Now he could clearly see the pattern of manipulation and betrayal that had shaped his life without him realizing it. "Let's use this," Hazel suggested, her investigative instinct active. "We can trace other victims, offer closure to families who may not even know they've been affected. In the evening, during a private dinner at the Sapphire Bay Penthouse, Julian and Hazel were celebrating not only their professional victories, but also their first anniversary as a married couple. "You know what's funny?" Julian commented, pouring champagne. "If it hadn't been for all this conspiracy, we'd never have met." "Technically," Hazel smiled. "You should thank me for being hired to investigate you." "Oh yeah, and you should thank me for being such an interesting target worth keeping around." The moment was interrupted by an urgent message from Catherine. The SEC had approved new regulations based on the recommendations of the Ethics Board. It was a monumental victory for the industry. "For the future," Julian raised his glass. "For the truth," Hazel added, her eyes shining with love and determination. The Sapphire Bay Resort continued to shine in the San Diego night, no longer as a symbol of secrets and betrayals, but as a beacon of integrity and transformation. Julian and Hazel had not only saved a company, they had changed an entire industry and, in the process, found something much more precious: a partnership based on trust, respect, and true love. Their story proved that sometimes you have to wear masks to reveal the truth, but it's only when you remove them that you can truly find who you are. And as the sun set on another day on the California coast, they knew that their greatest adventures were yet to come.